Hi, I'm Chanel. Welcome to my bookbinding studio. Many of you have been asking for a hardcover book tutorial for a while now, so I'm excited to finally share this with you. The method is called case binding, and it's a classic book structure we all know and love. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make this book from start to finish. I'll run through all the tools and materials you'll need, but don't be too overwhelmed with all the specifics because I know that what I'm using isn't as accessible for you, depending on where you are. If you're an absolute beginner to bookbinding, I highly recommend checking out a couple of my other videos before attempting this one. With any bookbinding project, it's important to aim for progress, not perfection. So try your best and have fun. If you have handmade books at home, you can use this as a companion to the case binding project in the book. To make this book, we're going to sew the book block, glue and line the spine, make the hardcover case, and case in the book block. These are the tools you'll need. Pause this screen so that you can take note. You'll also need spacers. These are for the hardcover case. You'll need one that is 3/4 inch wide and one that is 3/8 or 1/4 inch wide. I'll talk more about hinge gaps later. You can make your own spacers with bookboard. Scrap boards clear taped on the long edge. These need to be fairly rigid. C-clamps or alternative hand clamps, waste sheets or scrap paper for gluing, and PVA glue. I recommend these ones or any acid-free white glue. Moisture barriers to prevent moisture transfer from glue, a book press, or pressing equipment like a flat board and weights. Hinge rods if you'd like to form nice grooves at the joints. I'm using double-pointed knitting needles. Fine grit sandpaper if you'll be hand trimming the book block. A sanding block is helpful. For the pages, I'm using 20 sheets of 32-pound text, 120 GSM paper. Pretty much all paper that come in reams are long grain, so we're going to cut that in half to make it short grain. All the paper, including the boards, should have grain direction running parallel to the spine. This is important for pages laying flatter and turning more easily. To check for grain, I'll bend the papers widthwise then lengthwise. The papers bend more easily along the short edge, so this paper is short grain. You'll also need stiff paper for the punching guide, linen thread that is pre-waxed or that you wax yourself, 2 sheets of decorative paper cut to the same size as your pages. These should also be short grain. I'm using handmade lokta paper, which doesn't have a grain direction. For starters, I would recommend a heavier weight paper like those from scrapbooking pads for easy gluing. A sheet of 2mm bookboard. I'm using Davy board, which is acid-free and warp-resistant. A sheet of book cloth. I made this myself using heat and bond and Japanese tissue paper. If you can't find Japanese tissue paper, use the thinnest acid-free paper you can find. I'll link the book cloth tutorial video in the description. Bookbinding mull or an alternative like cheesecloth. Endbands. This is ready to glue, or you can make your own. I'll show you how later. And finally, ribbon if you'd like a built-in bookmark. Don't worry about having the exact materials. Use what you can. You can still make a functioning book that looks great. To make the book block, start by folding 4 sheets of paper in half. This is the first signature. Crease the fold with a bone folder. I like to do a pass on each side. The sheets are not all the same length from hand cutting, so I'm grabbing 2 from the front and 2 from the back so that I end up with signatures of equal lengths. This is really going to help in creating a neat and tidy book block. Fold all the sheets until you have 10 signatures. To punch holes for sewing, create a guide with the stiff paper. Follow these measurements based on the size of paper you have. Check that your signatures are about the same length. This is your chance to trim them if needed. Working on the cutting mat, place the punching guide lined up on the left side edge of your first signature. With your awl, punch through the fold at a 45-degree angle. Check that you're punching straight through and that your holes are not deviating from the fold. I always have my signatures stacked like this with the folds facing away from me so that they don't get mixed up. Find a system that works for you so that the holes don't get misaligned after punching. After you're finished punching, check for hole alignment once more, and now we're ready to sew. Measure thread that is the length of the signatures times the number of signatures. So I'm counting to 10 here. To wax the thread, I'm just running it through this beeswax cake a couple times. Thread the needle on one end. This is how you can lock the thread on the needle. With the stack of signatures placed like this, flip over your first signature. We're going to sew French link stitch, and the holes will be referred to as sewing stations numbered from 1 to 6. Sew into station 6 and pull through to leave a 2-inch 5-centimeter tail. Sew out through station 5, being careful not to pull the thread out of the signature. Sew in through station 4. And out through station 3, in through station 2, and out through station 1. Hold the two ends of the thread and pull taut. Pick up a new signature and flip it over. Sew in through station 1 to the inside. Sew out through station 2 and line up the signatures. Oh, it's good luck if your thread knots at least once. To make your first French link, sew up behind the stitch below. Then sew through station 3 to the inside. Make another French link stitch between stations 4 and 5. Pull taut in the direction of sewing. Sew out through station 1 and connect the signatures by tying a knot between the starting and working ends of the thread. Flip over the next signature and sew into station 6. Sew out through station 5 and make a French link by sewing up behind the stitch on the previous signature. Keep going and make another French link between stations 3 and 2. When sewing, the thread tension should be taut, not tight, so just pull until you remove all the slack from the thread. Pull towards the direction of sewing so that you're not accidentally tearing paper. From now on, at the end of every signature, sew a kettle stitch to lock them together. Create a loop with the stitch below, and then sew up through that loop and pull taut. That's all you need to know to sew the rest of this book block. The way I sew for filming is not the most comfortable, so I recommend creating an elevated platform, probably something with more surface area than this brick, so that you can find the stations and create French links with ease. French link stitch is a great sewing method for a book of this size. The combination of French links and kettle stitches are strong enough without the need for extra spine supports. Note that it's normal for the book block to be a bit loose until you press and glue the spine. To finish sewing, tie the last kettle stitch and cut the thread. Lucy usually hangs out in the living room, but I was touched that she wanted to nap with me while I was sewing. I'm going to make a makeshift lying press with these 2 bricks, pressing boards, and C-clamps. Sandwich the book block between the pressing boards, tape side along the spine, and do your best to get the signatures to line up. You can also use a book press by propping it up vertically. Carefully clamp the boards near the spine without shifting the signatures. The book block can be a little slippery, so it might take some time to get it right. Place it between 2 blocky weights and adjust the clamps so that they're not pinching the spine. Aim for even pressure from head to tail. Press the spine firm enough so that the glue won't seep in between the signatures, but not so tight that the signatures are caving in or falling out of alignment. Trim the threads to 1/4 inch 6 mm and start applying glue to the spine. You can be pretty generous with the amount of glue, but don't use so much that it pools. For the first coat, just try to get glue into all the gaps, including in between the French links. I'm adding a bit more glue to the first coat. Use an awl to tuck in the thread ends and swipe between the pressing boards for easier detaching later on. After drying for at least 15 minutes, apply a second coat of glue. And then let the glue dry completely, at least half an hour. Dry time really depends on your location, climate, and humidity. Detach the boards and inspect the book block. It should have fairly square edges. In my book, I attach the end papers before the spine is glued, but you can also do it after, which is what I'm doing now. Fold them in half and make sure they're the same length as the book block. Make sure the smooth or patterned side is on the inside. Using the waste sheets, mask the end paper, leaving a 1/8 inch 3mm strip at the fold. Brush on glue and tip it onto the book block lined up at the spine. Don't worry about the foredge, the edge opposite of the spine, because we're going to trim it. Tip on the remaining end paper and now we can start trimming. Use a fresh blade and a non-slip metal ruler. Stand up with one foot in front of the other so you have more leverage. Hold down the ruler firmly and do not move it until you hit the mat. When you're cutting, use less pressure than you think, letting the blade do the work. Make sure you're using consistent pressure as well. This is a really hard step to do by hand, so many binders opt to invest in a guillotine, or if you're interested in the traditional method, you can look into getting a bookbinding plow. I did this by hand for many years, so it's definitely possible to get better with practice. But I was pretty rusty and nervous about this part and ended up with some rough parts, so I'm going to smooth it over with sandpaper. I'm using a sanding block with 220 fine grit sandpaper. The foredge should be clamped firmly as you sand. I'm learning that the foredge should be flush with the boards or as close as possible. Once you're satisfied with the result, it's time to line the spine. To make your own end bands, brush glue on a small piece of fabric and fold it over some cotton twine. The tab should be about a 1/2 inch or 12mm. Use your bone folder to shape the piping. I chose a pretty stiff fabric for this. If you want the spine to be more flexible and for the book to lay flatter, use a lighter weight fabric. Cut the end bands to the same width as the spine. The length should be no longer than the kettle stitch. Identify the top of the book and glue the ribbon 1/3 to halfway down the spine. Use a good amount of glue for all the spine linings to make sure they're well attached. Dab glue on the spine and the end band to attach it. The end band on the top of the book is called a headband, and the end band on the bottom of the book is called a tail band. Press with the bone folder to help with adhesion. Let's cut and tuck in the ribbon and apply the mull. The mull should be about the same length as the spine and at least 3 times the width. I typically go for an inch of mull on either side of the spine. When glued, the mull adds strength to the spine and supports the hinges. The book block is finished. Set it aside to dry. To determine the size of the cover boards, measure the width and length of the book block. Add 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters to the length, and this is the size of boards to cut. My board is already the correct length, so I will cut 2 pieces to the width. One corner wasn't square, so I made a minor adjustment. Don't worry about making the boards perfectly square. For the spine board, sandwich the book block and measure the thickness of the spine plus the thickness of one board. I find that the width including both boards is too wide. Let's talk about hinge gaps. Here are 2 books bound with commercial book cloth with 2 different hinge gap widths. Opening the book with the wider hinge gap definitely feels looser. Spine movement feels more flexible, and it definitely stays open more easily. For this book, I'm going with a 3/8 inch, about 1 centimeter hinge gap. You can play around with different widths. Use a millimeter ruler for accurate measuring. With so many steps of measuring and cutting, it can be easy to mess up, so I depend on this method a lot to make sure that the case is the right fit. Place artist tape or washi tape across the spine board and flip it over. Place the hinge gap spacer on one side and then the cover board next to it. Assemble the makeshift covers and remove the spacer. Wrap the boards around the book block and push the book block against the spine. The hinge gap will seem quite roomy right now, but it will be stabilized once the cover material is applied. Take note of the fit. The spine should be a proportional width, and the overhang at the head and tail should be even, about 1/8 inch or 3 millimeters. The foredge is likely too long, so we're going to trim that to the same overhang, 1/8 inch or 3 millimeters. Mark where the book block ends at the head and tail, then mark your overhang and trim. Make sure the cut is square. Use the first cover as a guide for the second. Test fit the covers once more to confirm that it's a good fit. Once the cover material is applied, the fit should be nice and snug. To glue the book cloth, start by drawing a midline to indicate the placement of the spine board. Brush a thin layer of glue and place it centered on the midline. Put the spacer in place and glue on the first board. Be sure to not use too much glue here. The layer of glue should be thin and translucent. On the other hand, make sure you're using enough glue so that there are no dry spots which can cause bubbles on the cover. I'm used to using the squeeze bottle, but it is good practice to pick up glue with your brush from a glue bowl or a container. When attaching the boards, check for alignment at the head and tail. You can also place a straight edge at the top or bottom to help with this. Remove the spacers and rub on the book cloth with the bone folder. Use the tip of the folder to form grooves at the hinges. I'm pressing the tip against the edges of the boards. Different materials will respond accordingly, so this stiff fabric required several firm passes, whereas commercial book cloth is quite thin and easy to mold. Use the 3/4 inch 1.9 centimeter spacer and the rotary cutter to trim the book cloth. These tabs that we'll be gluing onto the boards are called turn-ins. Cut the cloth at a 45-degree angle, leaving a tiny space at the board corners. The tiny space should be wider than the thickness of the board, as it'll be important for creating neat and protected cover corners. Gluing the turn-ins is pretty straightforward. Always start with the head and tail, and glue the outer side tabs last. This results in the corners overlapping in a way that is more resilient to wear and tear. This fabric took some work and patience. It's the bone folder that really helped me smooth it on. Be sure to form the hinges here as well. To create neat corners, use the bone folder to tuck in and press the corner bits flat. Then wrap the tab over and press with the help of a bone folder. This is optional. I dabbed a bit of glue to prevent fraying at the corners. Great job! The hardcover case is complete. You made it to the last step, casing in the book block. Holding the book together, take note of the gap between the book block and the cover at the foredge. Starting with the front cover, prop it up against an object. Have your moisture barriers and waste sheets handy. Slip a waste sheet under the end paper and trim the mull corners at an angle. Attach the mull first with a light layer of glue. Brush a thin layer of glue throughout the end paper. Since the paper will expand from moisture, brush gently and brush outward in a fan shape from the mid-spine. This will help minimize uneven paper expansion. Paper typically expands across the grain, so if the grain direction is parallel to the spine, the end paper will expand toward the foredge. With lokta paper having no grain, the expansion can happen anywhere. I didn't notice much with these sheets though. Thinner papers will stretch more, so that's why I recommend a heavier weight paper for beginners. Lift each outer corner and place them squarely onto the cover, leaving the overhang spacing you noted earlier, about 1/8 inch or 3 millimeters. Remove the waste sheet and holding the edge of the end paper in place, turn the book over. Hold the book up with one hand and carefully smooth the end paper with the other hand. If the paper is delicate, use parchment paper or the moisture barrier as a pressing layer. Smooth down further with a bone folder. Pasting the remaining end paper is essentially the same process. Pay special attention to the alignment of the spine and the overall book block. Try your best to snug the book block against the spine board as much as possible. I actually didn't really pay attention to that, so you can kind of see here that there's a little gap at the spine. I was able to peel off the end paper without damaging it, so I can try again. PVA dries relatively quickly, so usually it's stuck on. But I'm glad that I was able to reposition it and show you in this video. I haven't really shown my mistakes, but I have had my fair share of tearing glued paper off of bookboard in order to redo something. If you've finished a book and you notice issues stemming from the casing in step, you can totally cut out the book block, reapply the end papers, apply more mull, and try again. This time I made sure the spine is snug and I'm much happier with it. To press the book, I'm placing knitting needles at the hinges. I've been enjoying the simplicity of pressing with weights, so I haven't been using my book press much. I'm covering the book with a flat board and 2 bricks. Leave the book pressed for at least 8 hours or overnight. Let me know if you feel as excited and satisfied as me when you're taking a book out of the press. Carefully remove the moisture barriers because they might be sticky. Warm up the spine by opening the book at the middle first, then open it at different parts of the book. Finish up by cutting the ribbon and sealing it with a lighter. Now the book is ready to use. You are amazing. You did it. You should be so proud. I hope this video is a valuable resource to you. You can always come back here to be guided along on your future case binding projects. Special thanks to my patrons for supporting me this past year. I appreciate you all so much. If you want weekly bookbinding tips and to stay updated on all my projects, I invite you to join the Practicing and Aspiring Binders tier on Patreon. And you can join my Discord server for free, where there are hundreds of creative and curious binders that you can share your projects with and discuss bookbinding. Thank you for your trust. Happy bookbinding!